Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the Western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
The Tale of Mrs Tittlemouse by Beatrix Potter, 1866 to 1943. Once upon a time, there was a wood mouse named Mrs Tittlemouse. She lived in a bank beneath a hedge. What a funny little house! There were endless sandy tunnels leading to storerooms, nut cellars, and seed cellars, all winding through the roots of the hedge. There was a kitchen, a parlour, a pantry, and a larder, and of course there was Mrs Tittlemouse's bedroom, where she slept in a cosy little box bed. Mrs Tittlemouse was an extremely tidy and fussy little mouse, always sweeping and dusting the soft sandy floors. Occasionally a beetle would wander into the tunnels. "Shoo, shoo, those dirty little feet," said Mrs Tittlemouse, rattling her dustpan. One day a little old woman in a red spotty cloak came running up and down. "Your house is on fire, Mother Ladybird. Fly home to your children." Another day a big fat spider came in to take shelter from the rain. "Excuse me, isn't this Miss Muffet's place?" "Go away, you bold, bad spider. You're leaving bits of cobweb all over my nice clean house." She hurried the spider out the window. He lowered himself down the hedge with a long, thin strand of silk. Mrs Tittlemouse made her way to a distant storeroom to gather cherry stones and thistledown seeds for dinner. As she walked down the passage, she sniffed the air and glanced at the floor. "I smell honey. Is it from the cowslips outside in the hedge? And I'm sure I can see the tracks of little dirty feet." As she turned a corner, she bumped into Babbity Bubble. "Zizz, bizz, bizz," buzzed the bumblebee. Mrs Tittlemouse gave her a stern look, wishing she had a broom in hand. "Good day, Babbity Bumble. I'd like to buy some beeswax, but what are you doing down here? Why do you always come in through a window and buzz like that?" Mrs Tittlemouse was starting to get annoyed. "Zizz, whizz, whizz," Babbity Bumble replied in an irritable little squeak. She slipped down the hallway and disappeared into a storage room that had once been used for acorns. Mrs Tittlemouse had eaten all the acorns before Christmas, so the room should have been empty, but instead it was filled with messy, dry moss. Mrs Tittlemouse started pulling out the moss. 3 or 4 other bees poked their heads out and buzzed angrily. "I don't usually rent out rooms. This is an invasion," said Mrs Tittlemouse. "I'll have them thrown out." Buzz, buzz, buzz. "Now who could help me?" Bizz, whiz, whiz. "I certainly won't ask Mr Jackson. He never wipes his feet." Mrs Tittlemouse decided to leave the bees alone until after dinner. When she returned to the parlour, she heard someone coughing in a deep, throaty voice, and there was Mr Jackson himself. He was squeezed into a tiny rocking chair, smiling and fidgeting with his thumbs while his feet rested on the fireplace fender. He lived in a drain beneath the hedge, in a filthy, damp ditch. "How are you, Mr Jackson? Oh dear, you've gotten soaked." Thank you, Mrs Tittlemouse. I'll sit here for a bit and dry off," said Mr Jackson. He sat there smiling as water dripped off his coat-tails. Mrs Tittlemouse went around with a mop. He sat for so long that she eventually had to ask if he'd like some dinner. First, she offered him cherry pits. Thank you, Mrs Tittlemouse. No teeth, said Mr Jackson. He opened his mouth much wider than needed, and sure enough, he didn't have a single tooth. Next, she offered him thistledown seeds. Poof, poof, puff, said Mr Jackson, as he blew the seeds all over the room. Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. But what I'd really like is a little dish of honey. I'm afraid I don't have any, Mr. Jackson, said Mrs. Tittlemouse. Mrs. Tittlemouse, replied the smiling Mr. Jackson, I can smell it, which is why I came to visit. Mr. Jackson got up heavily from the table and started looking in the cupboards. Mrs. Tittlemouse followed him with a dishcloth to wipe after his large, wet footprints from the parlor floor. After making sure there was no honey in the cupboards, he started to walk down the hallway. Honestly, you're going to get stuck, Mr. Jackson. First, he squeezed into the pantry. No honey? No honey, Mrs. Tittlemouse. There were 3 little critters hiding in the plate rack. 2 of them escaped, but he managed to catch the smallest one. Then he squeezed into the larder. Miss Butterfly was sampling the sugar, but she flew out the window. Mrs. Tittlemouse, it looks like you have plenty of visitors. And without any invitation, replied Mrs. Thomasina Tittlemouse. They walked down the sandy tunnel. Buzz, zing, zing. Mr. Jackson turned a corner, spotted Babbitty, grabbed her for a second, and then let her go. I don't like bumblebees. They're just too prickly, Mr. Jackson said, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. Get away, you nasty old toad, Babbitty Bumble screamed. I'm going to lose my mind, Mrs. Tittlemouse complained. She locked herself in the nut cellar while Mr. Jackson pulled out the bee's nest. He didn't seem to mind the stings. When Mrs. Tittlemouse finally came out, everyone had left. But the mess was awful. I've never seen such a disaster. Honey everywhere, bits of moss and thistle down, and dirty footprints, big and small, all over my nice clean house. She cleaned up the moss and the leftover beeswax. Then she went outside and gathered some twigs to partly block the front door. I'll make it too small for Mr. Jackson to get in. She got some soap, a flannel, and a new scrubbing brush from the storeroom. But she was too tired to keep cleaning. First, she fell asleep in her chair, and then she went to bed. Will my house ever be tidy again? Sighed poor Mrs. Tittlemouse. The next morning, she woke up very early and started a spring cleaning that lasted 2 weeks. She swept, scrubbed, dusted, and polished the furniture with beeswax. She even shined her little tin spoons. Once everything was beautifully neat and clean, she hosted a party for 5 other little mice without Mr. Jackson. He smelled the party and came up the hill, but he couldn't fit through the door. So they passed him acorn cups of honeydew through the window, and he wasn't offended at all. He sat outside in the sun and said, "Cheers to your good health, Mrs. Tittlemouse."
The Story of Miss Moppet by Beatrix Potter, 1866 to 1943. This is a cat named Miss Moppet. She thinks she heard a mouse. Here's the mouse, peeking out from behind the cupboard and teasing Miss Moppet. He's not scared of a kitten at all. Miss Moppet jumps, but she's too late. She misses the mouse and bumps her head. She thinks the cupboard is really hard. The mouse watches Miss Moppet from the top of the cupboard. Miss Moppet wraps a cloth round her head and sits by the fire. The mouse thinks she looks really unwell. He slides down the bell rope. Miss Moppet looks worse and worse. The mouse moves a little closer. Miss Moppet holds her aching head in her paws and watches him through a hole in the cloth. The mouse comes very close. Then, all of a sudden, Miss Moppet pounces on the mouse. Since the mouse teased Miss Moppet, she decides to tease him back, which isn't very nice of her. She ties him up in the cloth and tosses it around like a ball. But she forgot about the hole in the cloth, and when she untied it, there was no mouse. He wriggled out and ran away, and now he's dancing a jig on top of the cupboard. The Story of a Fierce Bad Rabbit by Beatrix Potter, 1866 to 1943. This is a fierce, bad rabbit. Look at his wild whiskers, sharp claws, and curled-up tail. This is a nice, gentle rabbit. His mother has given him a carrot. The bad rabbit wants some carrot. He doesn't say please, he just takes it. And he scratches the good rabbit really badly. The good rabbit sneaks away and hides in a hole. It feels sad. This man is holding a gun. He sees something on a bench and thinks it's a strange-looking bird. He comes creeping up behind the trees. And then he shoots. Bang! This is what happens next. But this is all he finds on the bench when he rushes up with his gun. The good rabbit peeks out of its hole, and it sees the bad rabbit running by without a tail or any whiskers.